There are some things a horse remembers that a man can forget. In the summer of 1902, out beyond the dusty streets of a small Wyoming Territory town, Sheriff Nathan Cole learned that lesson beside a lonely grave. It was just after sunrise when Nathan first noticed something was wrong. His horse, Copper, had stopped walking. The old sorrel gelding stood at the edge of Willow Creek Cemetery, with his head lowered and his ears pointed toward a single grave beneath a crooked cottonwood tree. Nathan tugged gently on the reins. "Come on, boy." Copper did not move. Nathan tried again. Nothing. The sheriff climbed down from the saddle and walked closer. The grave was not remarkable. Its wooden marker was weathered and leaning slightly to one side. The name carved into it had faded beneath years of sun and rain. Thomas Hart. Nathan stared at it for a moment. He knew the name. Everyone in town did. Thomas Hart had died 7 years earlier, according to the cemetery records. His widow, Maggie, had been left with a small ranch and a young child to raise. But there was something about this grave that Nathan had never liked. He couldn't have said why. Maybe it was because Thomas had been buried alone. Maybe because nobody seemed to remember much about the man anymore. Or maybe because every time Nathan passed this corner of the cemetery, he felt as though something unfinished was waiting beneath the ground. Copper suddenly pawed at the dirt. Once, then again. Nathan turned sharply. Easy. The horse lowered his head until his nose nearly touched the wooden marker. Then he gave a quiet, trembling sound. Nathan had ridden Copper for more than 12 years. He had crossed flooded rivers with him. He had ridden through winter storms and long summer nights. He knew when the horse was frightened. He knew when Copper smelled a mountain lion. He knew when something was simply bothering him. But this was different. Copper wasn't afraid. He seemed determined. Nathan pulled him backward. Copper resisted. The sheriff frowned. "You're not going to win this one, old boy." He led Copper away by several yards. The horse immediately pulled toward the grave again. Nathan stopped. For the first time, a strange uneasiness settled in his chest. Across the cemetery, someone was watching. An old man stood beside a row of neglected stones, wearing a faded brown coat and a wide-brimmed hat, bleached pale by years beneath the western sun. Elias Boone. He had once been one of the finest cowboys in the territory. Now he was simply an old ranch hand who kept mostly to himself. Elias slowly approached. Nathan nodded toward him. "You ever seen a horse behave like this?" Elias didn't answer immediately. He looked at Copper, then at the grave, then back at Copper. The old cowboy's expression changed. "You said this is the first time?" "First time he's refused to leave." Elias stepped closer. Copper became perfectly still. The old cowboy studied the horse's face. Then he crouched beside the grave. His fingers brushed away a thin layer of dirt near the base of the marker. Nathan watched him carefully. "What are you looking for?" Elias shook his head. "Not sure yet." A breeze moved through the cottonwood branches overhead. The cemetery fell strangely quiet. Then Elias noticed something carved into the back of the wooden marker. He stood slowly. Nathan walked around the grave. At first, he saw nothing. Then Elias wiped away years of dust with his sleeve. There, beneath the faded name, was a small symbol. A circle, crossed by 3 short lines. Nathan's face tightened. He had seen that mark before. But not here. Not on a grave. Elias stared at it for several seconds. Then his voice dropped almost to a whisper. "I haven't seen that mark in 30 years. Nathan looked at him. "What does it mean?" Elias didn't answer. Instead, he looked at Copper. The horse was still staring at the grave. And suddenly, the old cowboy understood something that made the years disappear from his face. Copper wasn't refusing to leave because he was frightened. He was waiting. Waiting for someone to remember. And whatever Copper remembered had been buried with Thomas Hart. Elias slowly reached toward the old grave marker. But before his fingers touched it, he stopped, because beneath the faded symbol was something else. A second name, one that had been deliberately scratched away. And Elias knew exactly whose name it had once been. Elias knew exactly whose name had once been carved beneath that faded symbol. But for several seconds, he said nothing. He simply stood there, with his hand hovering over the weathered wood, staring at the shallow scratches where someone had tried to erase the letters. Sheriff Nathan Cole noticed the change in his face. "You know that name." Elias slowly lowered his hand. "I know who it belonged to." Nathan waited. The old cowboy looked toward the cemetery gate, as if expecting someone to appear there. Then he said quietly, "Daniel Boone." Nathan's eyes narrowed. "Your brother?" Elias nodded. For the first time that morning, the old cowboy looked tired. "Daniel disappeared 30 years ago." Nathan glanced back at the marker. "You told me he died." "I told people what I thought they needed to hear." The sheriff frowned. Elias stepped closer to the grave. Daniel was 26 when he vanished. He rode north with a cattle outfit and never came back. No body, no grave, no explanation. Nathan looked again at the scratched-away name. "And you think his name was here?" "I don't think it." Elias pointed toward the wood. "I know it." A cold breeze moved through the cemetery. Nathan removed his hat. "How?" "Because I carved it." The sheriff stared at him. Elias continued before Nathan could ask another question. "Daniel and I used that mark when we were boys. 3 lines through a circle. It meant family. If one of us left a trail, the other could follow it." Nathan looked at Copper. The horse had lowered his head again. "You think Copper remembers your brother?" Elias shook his head. Copper wasn't his horse. Nathan's eyes moved toward the old gelding. "Then whose was he?" Elias looked directly at him. "Thomas Hart's." That answer seemed to settle heavily over the cemetery. Nathan remembered Thomas Hart now. Not clearly, just fragments. A quiet rancher. A man who rarely came into town. A man who had once been seen riding with Daniel Boone. Nathan swallowed. "How long did you know Thomas?" "Long enough to know he wasn't the man people thought he was." "What does that mean?" Elias didn't answer. Instead, he walked around the grave and examined the ground. Copper followed him. The horse stopped at the exact spot where Elias had been looking. Then Copper pawed the dirt. Elias crouched. There, beneath the dry grass, was a small patch of earth that looked different from the rest. Nathan noticed it too. "That ground has been disturbed." "Recently?" Elias touched it. "No." He brushed away more dirt. A faint metallic edge appeared beneath the soil. Nathan immediately reached for his pocket knife. Together, they cleared the dirt around it. After a few minutes, they uncovered a small rusted tin box. Copper suddenly stepped backward. Nathan looked at Elias. Neither man spoke. The sheriff carefully lifted the box from the earth. Its lid was secured with a bent piece of wire. Nathan opened it. Inside was a folded piece of yellowed paper, a brass key, and a small silver button engraved with the same circle and 3-line symbol. Elias stared at the button. His breathing changed. That belonged to Daniel. Nathan unfolded the paper. The handwriting was faded, but still readable. There were only a few lines. Nathan read them aloud. "If this is found, don't trust the story they told about Thomas Hart." Elias closed his eyes. Nathan continued reading. "His grave is not where the truth is buried." The sheriff looked up. "What does that mean?" Elias took the paper from him. For several moments, he studied the handwriting. Then his eyes moved toward the northern edge of the cemetery. There was another grave. Nathan followed his gaze. Another grave? Not marked. Elias stood. "Daniel once told me that if anything happened to him, I should look beneath the oldest cottonwood in the cemetery." Nathan looked toward the massive tree at the far end of the grounds. Its branches twisted over the cemetery wall. "And why didn't you?" Elias looked down at the paper. "Because I was told Daniel was dead." The silence between them grew heavier. Then a small voice came from behind the cemetery gate. "Sheriff?" Nathan turned. Maggie Hart stood there with her 9-year-old son, Tommy, beside her. Her face was pale. She had clearly heard enough to know something was wrong. Nathan quickly folded the paper. "Maggie." You shouldn't be here. She looked past him toward the grave, then toward Elias. That's my husband's grave. Elias stared at her. Maggie took one hesitant step forward. I came because Tommy said Copper was here. The boy looked at the horse, then at the grave. I told Mama, Tommy whispered. The horse comes here every year. Nathan's expression changed. Every year? Tommy nodded. On the same day, Elias slowly turned toward the grave. The old cowboy's face went pale. What day? Tommy looked at him. The day my father disappeared. Elias froze, and suddenly, the brass key in Nathan's hand felt much heavier than it had a moment before. And suddenly, the brass key in Nathan's hand felt much heavier than it had a moment before. Nobody spoke. Even the wind seemed to disappear among the cottonwoods. Maggie stood beside Tommy, staring at the three men as though she had walked into a story that had been waiting 7 years to be told. What are you hiding from me? She asked. Sheriff Nathan Cole looked down at the key. We're not sure yet. Maggie's eyes moved to Elias. But you know something. The old cowboy didn't deny it. I knew your husband before you did. Maggie stiffened. You knew Thomas? Yes. Then why didn't you ever tell me? Elias looked toward the grave. Because Thomas asked me not to. That answer only deepened the mystery. Maggie stepped closer. My husband died 7 years ago. I've spent 7 years hearing people say he was a quiet man who kept to himself. If you know something different, I deserve to know. Elias looked at Tommy. Then back at Maggie. You do. Nathan unfolded Daniel Boone's note again. There's something buried here. Maybe something that explains what happened to Thomas. Maggie stared at the weathered grave marker. What could possibly be buried there? Elias pointed toward the northern edge of the cemetery. Daniel's note mentioned the oldest cottonwood. They crossed the cemetery together. Copper followed. The old horse moved slowly now, no longer fighting the reins. Tommy stayed close to his mother. When they reached the massive cottonwood, Elias walked around its trunk. He stopped beside a patch of exposed roots. There. Nathan crouched. Tucked between 2 roots was a narrow iron lock. He pulled out the brass key. It fit perfectly. The lock opened with a faint metallic click. Nathan lifted a small wooden compartment hidden beneath the roots. Inside was a leather pouch. Elias reached for it, but stopped. You open it. Nathan loosened the leather tie. Inside were several folded papers, an old photograph, and a sheriff's badge. Nathan stared at the badge. His face changed. That isn't mine. Elias took the photograph. It showed 3 young men standing beside a ranch fence. One was unmistakably Elias. Another was Daniel Boone. The third man was Thomas Hart. Maggie stepped closer. That was my husband. Yes, Elias said. But why were they together? Elias looked at the photograph for a long moment. Because Thomas wasn't just a rancher. Nathan unfolded the first paper. It was a handwritten statement. He read silently, then looked up. Thomas and Daniel were witnesses. To what? Maggie asked. Elias answered. A land theft. Maggie frowned. Whose land? Several families. Elias explained that 30 years earlier, a powerful land buyer had been forcing small ranchers from their property. Daniel and Thomas had discovered that false claims were being filed at the county office. They had collected evidence. Then Daniel disappeared. Years later, Thomas had settled quietly near Willow Creek. Nathan looked at the papers. Why would Thomas keep this secret for so long? Because someone was still looking for the evidence. Maggie shook her head. But Thomas died 7 years ago. Elias looked at her. Exactly. Copper suddenly pulled away from Nathan. The horse walked back toward Thomas Hart's grave. Then he stopped beside the marker and began pawing the ground again. This time, Elias understood. He's not remembering the grave. Nathan looked at him. Then what is he remembering? Elias walked toward Copper, where Thomas left something. They watched as Copper pawed the dirt repeatedly. Nathan dropped to his knees and began clearing the loose soil. His fingers struck wood. A small wooden box was buried beneath the ground. Maggie covered her mouth. Nathan pulled it free. Inside was a folded letter wrapped in oilcloth. The name on the outside was written in Thomas Hart's handwriting. For Maggie, if I never come home. Maggie's eyes filled with tears. She reached for it. But before she could open the letter, Elias noticed something else beneath the box. A second piece of paper. He pulled it free. There were only 4 words written across it. They know about you. Elias looked toward the cemetery gate. For the first time, his expression showed fear. Someone had been watching them. And somewhere beyond the cottonwoods, a horse shifted in the distance. Then came the faint sound of approaching hoofbeats. Everyone turned toward the cemetery gate. Nathan immediately stepped in front of Maggie and Tommy. Elias stood beside him, his eyes fixed on the road beyond the cottonwoods. But no rider appeared. The hoofbeats faded into the distance. Only then did Nathan realize that Copper was no longer staring toward the road. The old horse had returned to Thomas Hart's grave. He stood there quietly, as if his work was finished. Maggie looked down at the letter in her trembling hands. "For me," she whispered. Nathan nodded. "You should read it." She carefully unfolded the paper. The handwriting was unmistakably Thomas's. Maggie read the first few lines silently. Then tears began rolling down her cheeks. "What does it say?" Nathan asked gently. She looked up. He knew someone was coming for him. Elias lowered his head. Maggie continued reading. Thomas explained that years earlier, he and Daniel Boone had discovered a group of men falsifying land records and stealing ranches from families who could not defend themselves. They had gathered proof. Daniel disappeared before they could expose the men. Thomas survived because he kept quiet. But eventually, someone learned that he still had the evidence. That was why he had hidden the documents beneath the old cottonwood. And that was why he had trusted Copper. Maggie looked at the horse. "Thomas taught him to come here?" Elias nodded slowly. "Not exactly." He pointed toward the letter. "Your husband knew that if anything happened to him, Copper would remember the place." Maggie wiped her eyes. Thomas had written that Copper had carried him to the cemetery on the night before he died. He had hidden the evidence beneath the grave marker. But he had never intended to leave it there forever. He had planned to return. He never got the chance. Nathan looked at the papers from the wooden box. "There's enough here to prove the land theft." Elias nodded. "And enough to explain Daniel's disappearance." Maggie stared at him. "You think Daniel was killed?" Elias looked toward the old cottonwood. "I think he was trying to protect these people." He paused. "And I think Thomas carried that guilt for the rest of his life." Nathan carefully gathered the documents. Then he noticed something written on the final page. A name. Caleb Rusk. Nathan's face hardened. Maggie recognized it. "Who is that?" "The county land commissioner," Nathan said. "He's still alive?" "Yes." Elias looked toward the distant road. "And he's still powerful." Nathan folded the documents. "Not for much longer." 3 days later, Sheriff Nathan Cole rode into the county seat with the evidence. The papers were examined. Old land records were reopened. Families who had been pushed from their ranches decades earlier finally had their claims recognized. And Caleb Rusk, now an old man himself, was forced to answer questions he had spent 30 years avoiding. But for Maggie, the most important truth was simpler. Thomas had not abandoned her. He had spent his final days trying to protect her and Tommy. One evening, she returned to Willow Creek Cemetery with her son. Copper was already there. The old horse stood beside Thomas's grave beneath the cottonwood. Maggie placed a small bundle of wildflowers against the marker. Tommy looked at the worn wooden sign. Why did Dad bury the truth here? Maggie looked at Elias. The old cowboy smiled sadly. Because sometimes a man has nowhere else safe enough to leave it. Tommy thought about that. Then he looked at Copper. He remembered. Elias nodded. He remembered what we forgot. The next morning, Elias prepared to leave town. His saddle was packed, and his old horse waited outside the livery. Nathan found him there. "You leaving?" Elias nodded. "There's not much left for me here," Nathan smiled. I'd say there's one thing. Elias looked toward the cemetery. Copper stood beside Thomas Hart's grave one final time. Elias watched quietly. Then he walked over and placed his hand against the old horse's neck. You can go now, boy. Copper lifted his head. For a moment, he looked toward the grave. Then he turned and followed Elias. Years later, people in Willow Creek still told the story of the sheriff's horse who refused to leave one grave. Some said Copper had sensed something buried beneath the earth. Others believed the horse simply remembered his master's final journey. But Elias Boone knew the truth. Copper had not been guarding a grave. He had been guarding a promise. A promise made by a dying man that the truth would someday be found. And when that truth finally came into the light, the old horse finally knew he was free to leave. Because sometimes, the things we bury are not meant to stay forgotten. Sometimes, they are waiting for someone brave enough to remember. And sometimes, all it takes is one faithful heart, even the heart of an old horse, to lead us back to the truth. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to subscribe and join us for more forgotten frontier stories, where every grave has a story, every trail holds a secret, and sometimes the smallest act of loyalty can change everything.